Before filming, I'm kneeling. I'm praying to the divine. And when I open my eyes, I see a little bug crawling around in front of me on the ground. He's a bottom feeder, I say to myself. Look at him scrounging around for scraps. He's like me, before my fall from spirituality. I was a spiritual teacher once. I had a Sangha, which is the Buddhist term for a spiritual community. And this Sangha spanned the globe. I had different groups of students in every country of the world. You've heard of me, but now I go by a different name and I look different. My hair is longer. I have a beard. But only just a few months ago, I was clean shaven, short hair, and I had disciples everywhere. I was a spiritual teacher for a decade, and it's part of a lineage that went back 2,500 years. It's not one of the major religions, it's an obscure sect. Some regard it as a cult, but I suppose that depends upon your perspective. It's an obscure sect, like I said, and at the same time, we kind of broke into the global arena within the last 2-3 decades. So you know of us, even though I don't feel licensed or, entitled to mention this lineage. I was a rising star. Like I said, I had a Sangha with communities in every country in the world. I was drawn to this sect because I had a problem with touching myself. I would touch myself at least 3, 4, 5 dozen times a day. And this was a real problem for me in my relationships, my professional life. And I sought help, counsel, assistance, advice, and I eventually found this lineage that was actually built around spiritual recovery from the predicament of touching oneself. So evidently this is a problem 2.5 millennia ago, and some adepts in India took it upon themselves to formulate essentially a religion, or a spirituality, so to speak, that helped people stop touching themselves. And so I joined that lineage a couple decades ago, and really got good at it, because I found that I was good at not touching myself, just as good at not touching myself as I was at touching myself. So, you do all the normal stuff, which is the meditation and the yoga and the spiritual teachings and the sitting with the master. What else do? You practice a moral code, different rules, etc. for living in spiritual community. And when I had gone for 10 years without touching myself, I was allowed to teach. Needless to say, there are millions of people around the world who are trying to not touch themselves. It's apparent to me, at least, that touching oneself is an overcompensation for an absence of intimacy with not only oneself, but with the world. So we compensate for that in a very specific way that's under our executive control. And so touching oneself is a way of kind of balancing one's deficit so that you begin to feel whole. Because we don't touch each other as a culture, generally speaking, in Western countries. Public displays of affection, not only in the romantic sense, but also just in the friendship sense, are, well, you know, that sort of affection has been on the decline for maybe hundreds of years. So now we find ourselves in the 21st century where we have a veritable epidemic of human beings in the millions, perhaps billions, touching themselves. So now we have a new spiritual demand for people to stop touching themselves. And they basically, you can start off in a real fundamental sense at the beginning of your training by, essentially handcuffing yourself so that you are without means to touch yourself. And there are other students who assist you in those kind of deeds or activities, etc., where you would need both hands free, but you don't because they're cuffed. Right? Now, of course, having them cuffed in front of you is not enough. You have to have them cuffed behind you. So it's more or less impossible to touch yourself. Right? So in my community, where I was located, we had, maybe a few hundred people, and there's different tiers, different levels of spiritual attainment. And the people at the top, or in the higher levels, so to speak, they assist the people at the lower levels who have great temptation to touch themselves, feel very, cut adrift in the world, and they're compensating mightily for the absence of physical intimacy in the world by ramping it up in their personal lives and going there. So I eventually became a senior member of our spiritual community, and I counseled people on how to stop touching themselves. And I helped put them in touch with their hearts, and so that they became more intimate with not only the world around them, but essentially more intimate with what they're thinking and feeling and their impulses and their desires and all that stuff, so that they can befriend this impulse to touch themselves, become intimate with that impulse to touch themselves, but then let it go. Right? They don't have to touch themselves. They've touched the need to touch themselves so that they don't have to touch themselves. Right? Because as you probably know from your own experience, once you start touching yourself more and more and more and more, you just can't ever stop. It becomes such an addictive kind of neurochemical loop in your brain. It's just over and over, and you don't know how to extricate yourself from it. So anyways, that's the background. I don't know if I necessarily had to step down, or I abdicated my position, or I was going to get kicked out. But I had an incident that was pretty much the end of it for me. I was giving what's called satsang, which is a Sanskrit term, which means in the company of truth, more or less, in the company of good. And satsang is when you have a guru, and then you have students. And in this case, I was in a packed tent in India with a bunch of Westerners, all sorts of spiritual types, but not just Westerners. You had local people from India and also from Tibet. And I was giving a discourse on touching oneself and how to abstain from that. It was really basic, actually, nothing complicated, because there's different levels of spiritual teaching, where you have most advanced spiritual teaching is still concerned with touching oneself, but it gets really sublimated so that it becomes a meditation upon the relationship between the most subtle traces of identity in the body-mind, and how those subtlest traces of identity are affixed with the impulse to touch oneself. But that requires such a microscope of attention that many years of meditation are required to see that kind of circuitry of connection, that circuitry of causality between the subtlest traces of self-identity and the impulse to touch oneself. And so I was giving a discourse, just basic stuff. And I must say I was actually quite gifted as a spiritual teacher. I knew how to captivate an audience, mesmerize them, hypnotize them, hold them in the palm of my hand. And I was up there. I don't know what came over me, but maybe this was an act of God. Maybe it was something that needed to happen to cast me from my exalted position on the spiritual circuit, on the world stage, so to speak. But I had thousands of people there, really, because there were hundreds inside the tent, but it was like a week-long retreat, so ultimately there was thousands of people. Standing room in the back. And we had a break, and people were getting refreshments. And while people were getting up and going to the refreshments outside of the tent, it seemed like nobody was looking at me. They were done with me, I suppose, for the time being. But apparently, someone saw me touch myself. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was trying to sabotage my spiritual prestige, but I touched myself. And then another person saw me because they saw that first person who was seeing me. The third person saw those two people. It's a domino effect. Pretty much in the span of less than a minute, I had all these adoring followers turn on me. Because I was up there on the stage touching myself. And this is the digital age, the internet. So someone made a video of it, and it spread. You can find it on YouTube. I was compulsive about it because I hadn't touched myself in, at this point, 20 years. 20 years of not touching myself. If you have any idea what that's like. So if you don't do it for 20 years and you're around the world teaching people not to do it, imagine the kind of inner demon whose sole purpose, reason for being, is to touch oneself. That's my demon. It's the demon inside of all of us. So here I am crusading across the world stage, telling people not to touch themselves and teaching them how to not touch themselves. Advocating for spiritual enlightenment through the abstinence of self-touching. And then I just touch myself. This is obviously the end of my career. And I'm unemployable. Because all I know how to do is not touch myself. And yet I don't know how to do that. Because I touch myself. I'm trying to make a comeback, so I'm not touching myself anymore. But obviously I have to go on almost a militant campaign to reestablish my integrity in the public eye. I'm concerned that I'm sending a kind of equivocal message to people that it's okay and not okay to touch oneself. And now I've got a new demon inside that won't allow me to have a kind of univocal position or perspective on the issue of touching oneself. Now I'm waffling, I'm ambivalent. I want my cake and eat it too kind of thing. So I'm a little bit still in recovery. Staying with friends, they're helping me to not touch myself. Although what they do behind their closed doors is another matter, because if you've been around this long enough, you kind of get a feeling for which human beings are touching themselves and which ones are not. You would be surprised how psychic you can get, telepathic, because people are all hiding this demon inside themselves. They want to touch themselves, and then it's like their hand starts to move and they're we're starving for intimacy. We have no choice but to touch ourselves. We want so badly to be touched by others, but we're not being touched by others. We walk around, nobody's hands are upon us. We could barely make eye contact in this world, much less people touching each other. And so we compensate. We touch each other and we touch ourselves madly. Several dozens of times a day. Hundreds of times a day. And yet we're stigmatized for it. Condemned and judged for simply touching ourselves. I mean, why is it such a crime? To touch myself.